Prepare yourself. Something enormous and shocking is about to happen. What you're about to hear may change everything you believe. We are living in a critical moment, more dangerous than you can imagine. While everyone is distracted, focused, on trivial and superficial things, something much greater, far more sinister, is moving in the shadows. A game is about to be revealed, and you can no longer ignore it. Do you feel the tension in the air? The world is on the brink of a drastic transformation, yet few seem to notice. The signs are everywhere, and the truth is hiding behind curtains of distraction. The question is, are you ready to see what's really happening? Or will you continue to be lost in the lies the system has fed you? The choice is in your hands. Don't wait until it's too late. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now and turn on notifications. Share this message with those who need to wake up to what's truly lurking beneath the surface. Time is running out, and the faster you act, the more prepared you'll be for what's coming. Stay alert. The future of the world may be about to change, and you will be part of that change. The world, as always, kept turning, but there was something in the air that felt different. The skies seemed heavier, the streets emptier, and the sound of conversations was quieter, muffled, as if humanity was beginning to lose its breath. Humanity was not prepared for what was coming, and the signs were everywhere, if you knew where to look. Civilization, once so sure of its ability to control everything, now felt the weight of fate drawing near. It was the year 2032, and ancient. Prophecies seemed to be unfolding one by one, unnoticed. In recent years, the global climate had shifted irreversibly. Storms had grown more violent, natural disasters more frequent, but what terrified people most was the growing sense of collective despair. It wasn't just an environmental crisis. It was as if something inside each person had broken, as if the spirit of humanity had been corrupted. In Jerusalem, the figure of Samuel Levitt was becoming a familiar name. Samuel wasn't just an ordinary preacher, he was someone who had a clear vision of what was coming. Revered by many as a prophet, he didn't see himself that way. He was simply a man trying to understand the signs around him. Since his youth, Samuel had experienced dreams and visions that guided him to a deeper understanding of what was happening. He knew the end was near, not because he wished for it, but because the evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. He had studied the scriptures his entire life, and over the years he began to see how the words written on those ancient sacred pages described the present moment with terrifying accuracy. He who has ears, let him hear. He who has eyes, let him see. These words of Jesus recorded in Matthew 24 were often quoted by Samuel. He believed that prophetic messages were not only for the past but for the present as well. What he was witnessing wasn't coincidence. It was the fulfillment of ancient prophecies foretelling that humanity would find itself on the brink of destruction. And time, to Samuel, was running out. The Western world, in contrast, seemed completely distracted. In Washington, political and economic leaders were more concerned with power and control than with the truth of what was happening globally. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, the region stood on the edge of a new, devastating conflict. The world's attention was fixed on disputes over resources and unstable alliances, but few seemed to understand the deeper meaning behind these events. To Samuel, the temporary peace everyone was seeking was nothing more than an illusion. He knew chaos was about to erupt irreversibly. At the small church in Jerusalem where he preached, Samuel gathered his followers one evening as the sun began to set behind the ancient city, casting long shadows like a silent warning. He sat before them and looked at the group, his eyes deep and calm as if he had already seen the end of all things. "Prepare yourselves," he said, his voice low but full of quiet authority. "What is coming cannot be avoided, but we can. Prepare to face what awaits us. It's not just a physical end that approaches, but a spiritual one. The world has drifted away from God, and now what remains is a final judgment. What is about to happen, many will not see, and those who do will not understand." The faces around him were tense. Many had heard rumors about his messages, but now at last they were paying attention. Samuel knew his words might sound like madness to some, But he also knew that for others, it was a sign that something greater was in motion, something that could no longer be stopped. The silence that followed was profound. Samuel felt the weight of the moment. He didn't have all the answers, but one thing was certain: he was not alone. Others, in distant places, were receiving similar visions. And those visions were connected, forming a pattern, a story being told through suffering and destruction. "We are living in days unlike any others," he said at last. "And that's why, now more than ever, we must prepare. There is no more time to ignore the signs. What happened before, what we call ancient, is returning. What once was will be again in one form or another. And we must be ready." With these words, the group dispersed, each immersed in their own thoughts. But deep down, they all knew Samuel was right. The world was changing, and the question was whether humanity would be able to face what was coming. In the days that followed, Samuel felt the pressure of his own words weighing more and more heavily on his shoulders. The vision he had been given, and which he had shared with his small group of followers, was becoming clearer and more vivid with each passing night. His dreams grew more intense, more detailed, and he knew the prophecy he carried was no metaphor. It was materializing all around him. On one of the deepest nights, Samuel awoke in a cold sweat, his heart racing. His vision was clear. He was back in ancient times in Jerusalem, standing before a great crowd watching him with fearful eyes. In his hands he held an ancient book whose pages seemed to burn as he turned them, revealing words he had never seen before. When he read aloud, the voice that came from his mouth didn't seem to be his own, but that of someone else. A distant, deep voice, as if it emanated from an age long forgotten. What he said was simple, yet terrifying. "The time has come. The great judgment cannot be avoided. The earth will tremble, the seas will rise, and the hearts of men will be tested. The end is not a punishment, but a choice. Humanity will decide its fate." He awoke abruptly, the sound of his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. Those words reverberated in his mind, and he knew they were not just part of a dream. They were a revelation, a truth he could no longer ignore. The next day, as he walked through the streets of Jerusalem, the scenes he saw aligned with the visions he had been given. The atmosphere was increasingly oppressive, as if an invisible shadow loomed over the city. The flow of tourists had dwindled, and the surrounding conversations were nothing but hurried whispers, with many fearing what was to come. Even nature seemed heavier. The sky was gray, the air dense, and the sound of birds, usually abundant, was absent. Samuel knew that something was about to happen, something big. He began to analyze world events more attentively, connecting news from all corners of the globe to the ancient scriptures. A war was imminent in the Middle East, with increasingly intense clashes between countries that were once allies. Tensions between major global powers were at a boiling point, and no one seemed able to stop the escalation. In his studies, Samuel found something that peculiarly caught his attention. A verse from Matthew 24, one he had read dozens of times, now took on new meaning. "You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come." Those words, which once seemed like a warning about the general chaos of the world, now felt like a precise summary of the reality he lived in. Wars were happening, and rumors of more were everywhere. But what shocked him most was the growing sense that these events were interconnected, like pieces of an apocalyptic puzzle he was just beginning to understand. World leaders, in turn, seemed to be playing a dangerous game, trying to guess who would be the next to fall, who would take the lead in a collapsing world. In Washington, political tensions were at their peak, with heated debates about the future of the global economy. In Moscow and Beijing, secret deals and military movements were kept under a veil of secrecy. But Samuel knew chaos was nearing its climax. However, what disturbed him most wasn't the conflict itself, but the division spreading rapidly within faith communities. Churches that once united in prayer were now splitting over how to interpret the signs. Some said the apocalypse was still far off, that global peace would be restored. Others believed destruction was imminent. In one of his sermons, Samuel addressed this division. He spoke about the differences in vision and how humanity, in its arrogance, believed it could control its destiny. What is true for one may not be true for another, but God's truth is unchangeable, he told his congregation, now filled with tense and anxious faces. No matter how much we divide ourselves, no matter how much we try to manipulate prophecy for our own comfort, the end will come, and it will be just. Our hearts, however, can still be spared if we turn to him. After the sermon, silence filled the church, but the weight of Samuel's words was undeniable. He felt he was not merely fulfilling a religious mission, but a divine role as a herald of the end. And he knew his task was not to convince everyone around him, but to prepare those ready to listen. As night fell over Jerusalem, Samuel retreated to the solitude of his small home, his hand still trembling from the gravity of his vision. The weight of his words remained with him, but he knew what was coming was far greater than anything he, or any human being, could imagine. In the days that followed, Samuel's unease only grew. He knew the world was approaching a breaking point and he could no longer ignore the signs around him. But as tensions rose, something else began to reveal itself. There were forces beyond human comprehension at work, and these forces were searching for Samuel. One night, as he meditated on the prophecies, a mysterious message reached him. There was no sender, but the envelope bore a symbol Samuel recognized immediately. A 5-pointed star, the symbol of a secret religious sect that had long operated in the shadows. The letter inside was simple yet disturbing. You have something the world needs. Do not ignore your calling. Samuel stared at the letter for long minutes, his thoughts tangled. He had heard of this sect, a secret group of spiritual and political leaders who believed themselves chosen to guide humanity into a new world. Its followers were powerful and influential, and their agenda was shrouded in mystery. Many believed they had access to ancient knowledge, something that could either save or destroy humanity, depending on how it was used. However, Samuel did not see himself as part of that game. He believed his mission was purely spiritual, a path of enlightenment, not of power. But the words in the letter still haunted him, and he knew that the temptation of such a calling could be irresistible to many. What he didn't know was that this temptation was about to entangle him more deeply than he had ever imagined. Days later, he received a formal invitation to a secret meeting in an underground facility on the outskirts of Jerusalem. The leader of the sect, a man named Elias, wanted to meet him in person. The message was clear. Together we can restore balance to the world before it's too late. Samuel knew this meeting would be far from simple, but curiosity, and perhaps a certain sense of destiny, led him to accept. When he arrived at the location, he was greeted by a small group of people, all wearing grave, serious expressions. Elias, a middle-aged man with piercing eyes, was waiting for him at the entrance. He extended his hand to Samuel, who shook it cautiously, yet without hesitation. There was something in the man that seemed to know his deepest thoughts, as if he could see through his soul. Samuel Levitt, Elias said in a calm voice, yet one filled with authority. You and I share a common mission. What the world doesn't see is the imminent destruction that is about to unfold. But there is a way. Together we can lead humanity toward survival. We don't have to wait for divine judgment. We can act ahead of it. Samuel stared at Elias. He knew this was a test, something that required more than simply accepting or rejecting. What Elias was proposing was a direct intervention, an attempt to save humanity, but at the cost of altering the very natural laws of divine order. Why me? Samuel asked, the doubt evident in his voice. What do you expect from me? Elias smiled, an enigmatic smile as if the answer were obvious. You have the power to unite people. You are the link between the human and the divine. Your vision is not just a gift, it's a key. With you, we can create a new beginning before the world completely destroys itself, as Samuel reflected. Elias led him into a room filled with maps, charts, and images of areas devastated by natural disasters. There were records of earthquakes, tsunamis, extreme droughts, and a global epidemic. Each image looked more apocalyptic than the last, and the visual impact was immediate. The hour is near, Elias continued. The forces of chaos are gaining strength, but there is still a chance. With your spiritual leadership and our practical knowledge, we can change the course of destiny. Samuel felt the weight of Elias's words. What was being proposed wasn't just a mission of faith. It was a battle for control over humanity's future. The sect offered knowledge and power in exchange for an alliance he knew was full of risks and moral consequences. The temptation was great. He could be the savior, but at what cost? But before he could respond, Elijah added one final sentence that remained etched in his mind. If you don't act, what is coming will be more destructive than anything you've ever seen. The apocalypse will not be only spiritual, it will be physical. And when it arrives, there will be no more room for regrets. Those words, spoken with a terrifying calm, brought about absolute silence. Samuel knew that this encounter was not just an opportunity, but a choice that would define the course of his life and possibly the fate of millions. As he walked away from the place, the darkness of the night enveloped him, and he realized that the path now stretching before him was no longer just a matter of faith or destiny. He was facing a dilemma. To follow Elijah meant forging an alliance with those who believed they could alter the course of events, but it also meant risking the purity of his mission. More than ever, he felt the weight of the choice was beyond his strength. In the days following the meeting with Elijah, Samuel felt deeply shaken. The dilemma presented to him gave him no peace. On one hand, there was the promise of power and knowledge capable of saving humanity from imminent destruction. On the other, the weight of his beliefs, which told him that directly intervening in the course of events could be an affront to the divine. The decision he needed to make was becoming increasingly difficult. Still, he couldn't ignore the calling he felt. The vision he had that night, the burning book as he flipped through, its pages now seemed like a constant reminder. Something was lost, something important, and he needed to find this lost prophecy if he was ever to understand the role he was meant to play. Determined to seek more answers, Samuel looked for the oldest and most respected scholar of the scriptures, in Jerusalem, an elderly man named Jonah. Jonah had spent his entire life studying the sacred texts, and many considered him the greatest living expert in biblical prophecy. If anyone could help him understand the vision, it was Jonah. The meeting was scheduled for a cloudy morning in a small apartment in the city center. Jonah welcomed Samuel with a curious look, but also with a wisdom that seemed to overflow. He knew Samuel had come for something great, and without asking directly, he seemed to understand the weight of the young man's quest. "I know what you seek, Samuel," said Jonah as soon as he sat at the table. "What you saw is something deeply rooted in the scriptures, but lost over time, a truth that few can still perceive." Jonah explained that although most prophecies had been interpreted in various ways over the centuries, some parts of the scriptures had been set aside or not understood at all. The lost prophecy, as he called it, was not about a future event, but a hidden revelation about the human spirit itself and its role in the outcome of the end times. "Do you see what's happening, Samuel?" Jonah asked, looking deeply into the young man's eyes. "What is being lost is not God's truth, but our ability to see what's truly at stake. The end is not merely a physical catastrophe. It is, first and foremost, spiritual. What you are witnessing, what is happening in the world, are the final echoes of a humanity that has strayed from its creator." Samuel reflected on those words for a long time. He already knew that physical destruction was imminent, but now the idea that humanity might be spiritually lost took hold of his heart. The visions and signs he had received were only part of a deeper truth, one that involved the very soul of humanity. Jonah then led him to a room filled with ancient scrolls and sacred manuscripts. "The lost prophecy is here," he said, pointing to a yellowed scroll preserved with the utmost care. "This is a text that few have studied, but it holds the key to understanding the final events." As the scroll was unrolled, Samuel saw that the words were in ancient Hebrew, and the meaning was complex, almost enigmatic. Jonah translated them with precision, revealing the words Samuel needed to hear. In the end times, souls will be weighed, and those who strayed from the path of truth will face the greatest tribulation. It will not be the fire of hell that purifies them, but the fire of the soul which will consume them until the last trace of their pride is gone. Pride is gone. Those words resonated within Samuel. He immediately understood that the tribulation mentioned was not just a physical battle, but an internal conflict, a confrontation with the very flaws of humanity. It would not be the destruction of the planet that would cause the greatest pain, but the destruction of the souls that had not repented, that had not prepared. So the apocalypse isn't just about the end of the physical world, Samuel murmured, trying to process what he had just learned. It's about the loss of souls. The true battle is spiritual. Jonah nodded gravely. Exactly. The world is already doomed to destroy itself. But the real question, Samuel, is, what will you do with the knowledge you have? Will you be the leader who helps souls prepare for the inner tribulation? Or will you give in to the temptation of the power being offered to you? What's at stake isn't just survival, it's salvation. Those words echoed in Samuel's mind as he left Jonah's home, now with greater clarity about what he had to do. He was no longer dealing only with a prophecy about the end of the world. He was facing a test of his own faith, of his ability to lead others toward true salvation. And as he walked through the streets of Jerusalem, feeling the weight of the world pressing in around him, Samuel knew that the decision he was about to make would be the most important of his life. He had reached a point of no return, and there was no more time for doubt. The fate of humanity, and his own fate, was about to be sealed. After the revelation of the lost prophecy, Samuel felt more prepared, but also more burdened. He knew the path ahead was a labyrinth, filled with choices that could alter the destiny of mankind. The weight of Jonah's words echoed in his mind. What is at stake is not just survival, but salvation. There was no more room for hesitation. The moment of decision was drawing near, and he could no longer afford to doubt. That night, Samuel withdrew to his home, seeking more answers. The world outside his window seemed to be descending into increasing chaos. Reports of devastating storms, global political crises, and growing military tensions between world powers filled the news. But something was still missing for Samuel. The connection he sought between the words of Scripture and the events unfolding around him needed to become clearer. Then he had a vision. This one was different from the others. It wasn't a vision of a distant future, but something that seemed to be happening simultaneously with the present. He saw cities consumed by a storm of fire, human hearts breaking, and among the ruins, a shadowy figure walked, spreading even more destruction. It was a representation of evil in its purest form, advancing upon humanity. But amidst the devastation, a light appeared. The light, though fragile, seemed strong enough to withstand the darkness. Samuel saw a multitude of people, lost and desperate, moving toward the light. He understood immediately. This was the last chance. The path he would now choose would define who would be saved and who would fall. When he awoke, the sense of urgency was even more intense. He knew that the global conflict was escalating and that soon things would reach a breaking point. The signs were clear. The imminent war in the Middle East, growing instability in various regions of the world, and internal spiritual divisions within his own faith. He sensed that, while people struggled to understand what was happening, time was running out. Global leaders were trying to calm the population, offering temporary solutions, but Samuel knew that nothing could stop what was already in motion. Political alliances were shifting by the day. The United States, a nation long known for its strength and influence, was in a moment of political transition, with new leaders assuming power, and, with them, new strategies that could alter the course of global events. The nation was internally divided, with sectors of society in conflict over how to face the global crises. In a public speech broadcast around the world, the new president of the United States announced a ceasefire with the Houthis, a movement that had until then been considered a threat to world peace. The peace initiative seemed like a positive step, but Samuel knew it was a disturbing sign. He had studied the scriptures, and what was happening did not align with the prophecies he had been examining. The temporary peace between old enemies seemed more like a trap, a false promise of safety before a devastating betrayal. He remembered Daniel 9, when the scriptures spoke of the covenant with many, which would be broken at the most critical moment. The ceasefire with the Houthis seemed to be exactly that, a temporary alliance that would not withstand the pressure of time. To Samuel, it was a manifestation of what he feared most. The true spiritual battle would not only be against the physical forces of war, but against the internal corruption of human souls, which could be led to accept false promises of peace. That very night, Samuel received a new invitation. This time, it came from a much more influential group, a coalition of religious and political leaders, all united by the belief that the apocalypse was about to occur. They had been monitoring Samuel's work and believed he was the key to preventing final destruction. They invited him to join them, but Samuel knew it would not be simple. They offered an alternative to the power of Elijah, a promise of salvation, but they were also willing to manipulate destiny for their own ends. The offer was tempting. They had resources, influence, and an army of followers. But Samuel remembered Jonas's words, "What is at stake is not just survival, but salvation." He could not allow himself to be seduced by power. He knew that if he made the wrong decision, the world could be lost forever. Deep inside, Samuel felt he had to act. But not in the way everyone expected. He was not a man of war or political alliances. The true enemy was deeper, more dangerous. What he needed was to gather those willing to seek a spiritual solution, a path of repentance and redemption, before it was too late. The storm was coming, and Samuel knew he could no longer hide. The final stage of the journey lay before him. Now he would have to choose, to follow the path of power or remain faithful to his divine mission. The weight of the decision loomed over Samuel like a constant shadow. Every step he took seemed to lead him to a crossroads, and every choice he made felt like a test of his faith and commitment to the truth. He knew the moment of choosing was near, and he could no longer delay. What was at stake was no longer just the survival of the physical world, but the redemption or damnation of souls. The invitation from the coalition of religious and political leaders still hovered over him, a promise of power and influence to lead humanity into a new era. On one hand, he could unite the nations and establish a temporary peace, a state of safety that offered a chance for rebuilding. But he knew deep in his soul that this peace would only be superficial, a facade concealing true corruption. The question was, could he really save the world without being corrupted in the process? Or by accepting the offer, would he simply be surrendering to the very power he was meant to resist? That morning, Samuel withdrew into the desert. He needed clarity, a space where he could reflect far from external pressures. As he walked through the golden sands, feeling the hot, dry breeze against his face, he found himself immersed in deep meditation, trying to understand what his true role was in this great spiritual drama. He felt that the answer was somewhere within him, but fear and doubt made the search for that truth a constant challenge. On his last journey, Samuel was met with fear and skepticism by those who had already heard of his message. He was called mad by many, and even some of his followers began to question his intentions. But what he had said from the beginning remained true. The apocalypse would not be a physical end, but an opportunity for humanity to be reborn, to find its way back to the light. It was then that he had a meeting with one of the most powerful leaders in the world, a man who had been his greatest opposition, but who also represented the true threat to his work. The President of the United States, a man whose policies Samuel had fiercely opposed, invited him for a private conversation. What Samuel didn't know was that this meeting would forever change the course of events. The president greeted him with a grave expression. He knew the world was on the brink of total war, and chaos was imminent. But he also knew that Samuel was a powerful figure, Someone who somehow could calm the situation and bring a measure of stability. Samuel, the president said, you've been seeing things in a way few others can. The world is falling apart, and I know you believe that the only way to save humanity is through spiritual change. But with all due respect, faith alone cannot solve the problems we face. Politics, diplomacy, military alliances, these are what will shape the future. Samuel looked at him calmly. I've never denied the role of politics or diplomacy, but it is the human spirit that lies in ruins. It's not just the global order that's breaking, but the inner order of each individual. Real change begins in the hearts of people, not on the battlefield or at the negotiation table. The president seemed to consider his words, but there was still skepticism in his eyes. Do you think we can afford to wait for that while the world falls apart? How many more must die before someone does something real? It was a valid question, but Samuel knew the problem wasn't one of immediate physical action. The real action was spiritual, and that was what he was trying to convey to the world. The president held a position of power, but the true power wasn't in weapons or peace treaties. It was in inner transformation, in awakening humanity to the spiritual reality it had been avoiding. You're right, Samuel said finally. There is a war underway and it can't be ignored. But it's not a war that can be won by military force. It is waged within the soul of every human being. And until humanity changes, until people turn inward and seek the truth, nothing lasting will be achieved. Weapons, treaties, and promises of peace will be in vain. The president stared at him, and for a moment Samuel felt something had changed in the man's eyes. Perhaps, just perhaps, he was beginning to see the truth Samuel had been trying to share. So what do you suggest? The president asked. I suggest you seek personal transformation, and as you do, call others to do the same. True peace will come when every person in every nation begins to look within and seek real change. There will be no true peace without spiritual reconciliation. The silence between the two was deep. Samuel knew that this meeting wouldn't solve the global crisis, but he felt the president had received the message, not as an immediate solution, but as a turning point. He didn't know if the world was ready for this transformation, but what he did know, and this was undeniable, was that he needed to continue his mission. Back in Jerusalem, Samuel sat alone in his temple, reflecting on what he had said. He knew his work was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The apocalypse, as he had always said, was not the end, but a chance for rebirth. And though humanity was lost in many ways, he believed there was still light at the end of the tunnel. Now more than ever, Samuel knew the final choice was his. He could follow the path of politics, war, and diplomacy, or he could continue his mission, trusting in the transformative power of faith. Samuel knew the world was waiting for his decision, and deep down, he also knew that no matter how difficult it was, his true mission was only just beginning. The global climate was at its most tense. Samuel's words echoed in every corner of the world, but they were received in different ways. Some saw him as a savior, a beacon of hope in hopeless times. Others considered him a madman, with ideas that didn't fit the political realism or logic of a world on the brink of total war. Humanity was fragmenting, and internal divisions were spreading at an alarming rate. Samuel no longer had the luxury of waiting for the perfect moment. He knew that the apocalypse, as he had foretold, was not just about external destruction. It was an inner spiritual process. What was happening around the world was not simply the result of political or climatic crises, but of a spiritual crisis. Judgment was about to happen, but not in the way many expected. It would not be a divine judgment in which souls would be separated between good and evil. No, this judgment would be of a different nature, the judgment of the human spirit. One night in Jerusalem, as the world continued its frenzied pace, Samuel climbed the mountain where he often meditated. It was an isolated space, far from the distractions of the modern world, where he could feel the divine presence more intensely. He knew something imminent was about to happen. The forces of destruction, external and internal, were about to collide. The vision he had that night was unlike any before. It was no longer a fragmented image of destruction or salvation, but a global understanding, as if he were seeing the entire world at once. He saw the hearts of people, individuals, families, communities, being tested in ways he had never imagined. Clashes of faith and selfishness collided. Forces of light and darkness battled within each human soul. He understood then that the judgment would not be a singular event but a continuous process, something that would take place in the hearts of all those willing to face the truth about themselves. Samuel realized that the greatest judgment would be the moment when each person would have to decide to follow the path of spiritual transformation or succumb to ego, fear, and despair. He saw that those who turned away from spiritual truth would be lost, plunging into darkness, while those who embraced the call for true change would join a new light, a light that was beginning to dawn even in the darkest hours. But it wouldn't be easy. Samuel knew the world was at a crossroads, and the forces of evil were taking advantage of human weakness. Increasingly, he saw politicians and global powers making empty promises of peace and prosperity, while hatred, greed, and fear grew in the shadows. The great movements of power across all continents were only feeding chaos in the name of security and order. Samuel knew the real problem wasn't in public policy or national borders, but in the lack of spiritual connection between people. When he descended the mountain that night, he felt a sense of urgency. He knew he could no longer wait for the perfect moment to act. The time was now. He went to the small community of faithful followers that remained, a scattered group, yet united by the same faith and hope. They were ready, or at least they wanted to be. "We are at a point of no return," Samuel told them at dawn the next morning. "Judgment will not come from the sky. Judgment is happening now, within each of us. Every choice we make, every word we speak, every act of faith or selfishness is part of that judgment. The world is in crisis not because nature is against us, but because we are in crisis within ourselves," he continued, his words carrying an unusual spiritual weight. "The apocalypse is not only about an end, but about a new beginning. The world will not be saved by those who cling to power or control, but by those who choose to look within and change, by those who choose true spiritual transformation. We cannot wait for things to improve on their own. Each of us must prepare for change, for inner transformation." Samuel's words reverberated among his followers. They felt the urgency of the moment, and for the first time in a long time, something began to shine in their eyes, the light of truth. The light of a transformation not based on physical or political control, but on inner change, on the search for the divine light within each person. The world, Samuel thought, was not lost. It was undergoing judgment, but that judgment was not something imposed from outside. It was something that sprang from within every human soul. The true judgment would be the moment when humanity confronted its own failures and the choice to change. And in that moment, Samuel knew clearly that he would not be the political savior the world expected. He was merely a messenger, a guide, leading those who were ready to understand that true transformation does not come from outside, but from within. And that's it, folks. If you made it this far, you know that what's coming next is going to transform everything around us. Don't let this message go unnoticed. Subscribe to the channel now and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss a single detail about the upcoming events that will shape our future. If this content made you reflect, leave a like. It helps us continue to bring meaningful information. And of course, share it with your friends and family, because the more people are prepared, the better. We're all in this journey together. Time is running out, and the choice to act now could be the difference between being prepared or being caught by surprise. Stay alert, because what comes next is even more revealing. See you in the next video.